I almost stayed home that morning. The coffee had just finished dripping, and the house still had that quiet feeling it gets after a cold night. I stood at the kitchen counter in my socks, looking out at the backyard, telling myself I could put it off one more day. The latch on the side gate needed tightening. The shrubs along the fence had gone uneven. There was always something small I could do with my hands if I didn't want to deal with something heavier. But I'd already put this off for 8 months. My wife had passed the previous fall, and I still hadn't gone to clear out her safe deposit box. Every time I thought about driving down to River County Bank on Main Street, something in my chest tightened. I'd picture that little private room downstairs, the metal box on the table, the stillness of it. My wife, Eleanor, used to say she kept her important papers there because she liked knowing certain things were protected from weather, fire, and people's opinions. She said it with a half smile, like she knew the world better than I did. That Tuesday in March, my attorney stopped being patient with me. He called at 7:15 in the morning. His voice was steady, practical. He said, "Tom, I know this is hard, but the estate can't be closed until that box is handled." I didn't argue. I just thanked him, set the phone down, and looked at it for a few seconds longer than I needed to. Then I put on my coat, picked up my keys, and drove the 12 miles into Hendersonville. The bank looked the same as it always had. Glass doors, clean brick, trimmed hedges out front. A place designed to feel orderly. Inside, the air smelled faintly like printer toner and floor polish. I could hear the soft clicks of keyboards behind the teller line and the low hum of the ceiling vents. A woman at one of the desks was laughing quietly with a customer about something on a form. Linda Mercer had managed that branch for years. My wife and I had known her the way you know people in a town long enough to wave from a grocery store parking lot and ask after each other's children by name. When she saw me come in, her face changed before I even reached the counter. Not surprise, not quite sympathy either. Concern. She stepped out from behind her desk and said my name in a low voice. "Tom, I'm glad you came in." There was something measured in the way she said it. Before I could answer, she glanced toward the lobby, then back at me. "Would you come to my office for a minute before we go downstairs?" I followed her without asking why. Her office was small and neat. One framed certificate on the wall, a potted plant near the window, 2 visitor chairs facing her desk. When she closed the door, the sounds from the lobby softened into a blur. She didn't sit right away. She stood with one hand on the back of her chair, then finally eased into it and folded her hands together. That was when I knew she had already decided exactly how to say whatever she needed to say. She looked at me and said, 9 days ago, someone came in and tried to gain access to Eleanor's safe deposit box. I didn't respond. I'm not even sure I breathed. She went on carefully. The man had come in with identification and paperwork claiming family authority after death. But he had copies, not originals. One of the signatures looked wrong. One of the notary marks didn't sit right with the teller who reviewed it. Their process required original documents and matching estate records, so access had been denied. Then she stopped talking. I asked her who it was. She turned her monitor toward me. The camera image was grainy. Gray jacket, side angle. A man standing near the vault corridor, shifting his weight to his left foot while he waited. I knew him immediately. It was my son, Ryan. I sat there for a while after that, long enough for Linda to bring me a paper cup of coffee I never drank. I held it in both hands because it gave me something to do. The lid warmed my palms. My son had tried to get into his mother's safe deposit box before I had even managed to do it myself. That thought settled in slowly. He had either known I was finally coming in, or he had been circling the same thing on his own. I didn't know which felt worse. Linda gave me a minute, then asked if I still wanted to go down to the vault. I said yes. The hallway to the lower level was as plain as I remembered. Beige walls, low lighting, the faint cool smell of metal and old paper. Linda unlocked one door, then another, and led me into the viewing room beside the vault wall. She slid the long, narrow box onto the table and told me to take my time. Then she stepped out and pulled the door almost closed behind her. For a moment, I just sat there. The box was smaller than I remembered, a dull gray rectangle with shallow scratches on the lid. I rested my hand on it and thought about Eleanor standing in this same room, probably with her handbag over one arm, probably moving with that quiet purpose she had whenever she was handling something she considered serious. Then I opened it. Inside was exactly what I expected at first. The house deed, our birth certificates, a velvet pouch with her mother's ring inside, A stack of old insurance papers held together with a fading clip. Normal things. The kinds of things people save because life asks for proof more often than it should. Then I lifted the papers at the bottom and found a sealed envelope. My full name was written on the front in Eleanor's handwriting. Not Tom. Not Honey. Not any of the private names a marriage collects over the years. Thomas Edward Bennett. Seeing it written that way made me sit back in the chair. There was also something else in the box, tucked farther underneath near the back corner. A small dark blue plastic case, the kind that might hold a flash drive or a spare key. I noticed it, but I didn't touch it yet. I picked up the envelope first. The paper felt smooth and firm, like she hadn't used whatever happened to be lying around. She had chosen it, prepared it, meant for it to be read carefully. I turned it over in my hands and looked once toward the half-closed door. Then I broke the seal, and I started reading. The letter was dated 11 weeks before Eleanor died. I noticed that first, before I took in any of the words under it. The date sat at the top right corner in her careful handwriting, plain and deliberate. Eleanor had learned cursive from nuns in a parish school outside Louisville, and even after all the years I'd known her, her writing still looked neat enough to belong on a church ledger. I read the first page once. Then I went back and read the first paragraph again. She told me she loved me. She said she was sorry she hadn't brought this to me sooner. She said she had wanted to be certain before she said anything, because she knew how I could be when I thought someone had crossed our family or our business. Not loud, not reckless, just final. She wrote that she did not want me making decisions from anger before there were facts to support them. That sounded exactly like her. Eleanor had a way of stepping between emotion and action without making a show of it. Over 40 years of marriage, that steadiness had probably saved me from more mistakes than I ever fully knew. I kept reading. A few years earlier, after I brought my partner, Leonard Price, into the company, Eleanor had handled the books for us part-time. Not forever, just long enough to help us through a growth stretch when the jobs got bigger and the paperwork started coming in stacks instead of folders. We were a construction outfit based outside Nashville. Commercial work mostly. Light industrial buildings, retail shells, a church addition once, and a senior care facility I had been proud of for a long time. Leonard handled clients and sales. I handled operations, permitting, crews, schedules, the part that turned drawings into walls and roofs and parking lots. For years, it worked. Then Eleanor stepped back from the books when her father got sick and needed more help at home. I hired an outside accounting firm. The company kept moving. Quarterly summaries came in. Taxes were filed. Jobs closed out. I looked at the totals the way a tired man looks at weather reports. Enough to know whether he needed a coat, not enough to understand the sky. Eleanor wrote that what she found had not been something she was looking for. She had gone into my home office to find a stapler. That part nearly made me stop reading, because it was such an ordinary beginning. A stapler. That was how real trouble usually started in my life. Not with a bang, with a drawer opened at the wrong time. She wrote that she had opened the lower right drawer of my desk by mistake and found a company folder that wasn't mine. Same letterhead, same project codes, same formatting. But the figures inside didn't match the reports I had been receiving from the accountants. Not exactly. Not in ways that could be explained by timing or draft versions or revisions. She didn't confront anyone. She didn't even tell me right away. Instead, over the next several weeks, she went back when I wasn't home. She photographed pages with her phone, billing records, routing slips, copies of invoices, internal notes. She wrote that she wasn't sure what all of it meant at first, but she knew enough to understand that two sets of numbers should never exist for the same work unless someone wanted one of them hidden. I remember lowering the pages then and staring at the table. The room was quiet in that particular bankway, a kind of silence built out of locked doors and thick walls. I could hear a faint metallic sound somewhere out in the vault, maybe a tray sliding on rails. My hands had gone cold. I picked the letter up again. What Eleanor had pieced together, as best she could, was that Leonard had been using a second billing path on several major jobs over a period of years. Inflated subcontractor charges, vendor payments to companies that only seemed to exist on paper, amounts charged to clients that did not line up with actual costs. The differences, she wrote, appeared to be moving somewhere outside our operating accounts. Then I reached the part that made the room seem smaller. On two of the internal approval pages, the name listed under payment release authorization was my son's, Ryan. He had been with the company for 4 years by then, handling job logistics and vendor coordination. I had brought him in because I thought I was giving him something solid, a place to learn the work, earn responsibility, build a future if he wanted one. He had never been the easiest child to guide. My daughter, Anna, had always moved through the world with a straighter line. Ryan took longer to settle, longer to trust himself, longer to find a gear and stay in it. I thought the business might help with that. Instead, his name was on pages my wife had hidden in a bank box. I sat there with the letter in my hands and read that section 3 times. Eleanor did not accuse him in the letter. That was important. She was too careful for that. She wrote only what she could support. His name appeared on approvals. His involvement was possible, maybe more than possible, but she was still trying to understand whether he knew the whole structure or had simply been used inside it. Near the end of the letter, she explained the blue case. She had copied all the photographs to a USB drive and placed it in the box in case anything happened to her, or in case she needed a secure place to keep the material until she could speak to an attorney. She had been planning to contact mine, David Keller, and also a forensic accountant she had researched in Nashville. She wanted someone independent to review everything before I was told. Then the last paragraph shifted. She wrote that she was frightened, though not in the way people often mean that word. Not panicked, not helpless. She wrote that she was frightened of what the truth would do once it entered the family. That line stayed with me. Not what the theft would do, not what the money would do, what the truth would do. Because she knew me well enough to understand that once I saw it clearly, I would not be able to pretend otherwise. The final line before her name was simple. She asked me to move carefully. Then she signed it the way she signed Christmas cards, birthday notes, and the little folded slips she used to tuck into my lunch cooler when we were younger and I was on site before sunrise. All my love, always. Eleanor. I folded the pages back into order and set them on the table. Then I reached for the blue plastic case. It snapped open with almost no resistance. Inside was a USB drive wrapped in a tissue she must have put there herself so it wouldn't rattle around. I held it in my palm and looked at it for a while. Such a small object. Lightweight. Quiet. Enough to change the shape of several lives. I put it in my coat pocket. Then I returned the ring, the deed, and everything else to the box exactly as I had found it, except for the letter. That I kept with me. When I stepped out, Linda was waiting just beyond the door, giving me the kind of distance decent people know how to give. She looked at my face and didn't ask what I had found. She only said, "Would you like a few more minutes?" I told her no. My voice sounded normal, which surprised me. At the front desk, I signed what needed signing. My pen moved steadily across the paper. I thanked her for catching the access attempt and for telling me before we went downstairs. She nodded once and said, "I thought you should hear it directly from me." I appreciated that. I still do. The drive home felt longer than the trip in. The sky had turned pale and flat, the sort of overcast Tennessee day where the light seems to come from nowhere in particular. At a red light near the feed store, I found myself gripping the steering wheel too tightly. Not from panic, more from concentration. Like my body had decided that if it held still enough, the facts might organize themselves. They didn't. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had reached only one conclusion, and it was not an emotional one. I could not confront anyone yet. Not Leonard. Not Ryan. Not until I knew exactly what I was holding. I went inside, set the letter on the kitchen table, and took off my coat. The house smelled faintly like dust and the lemon oil my daughter had used on the dining room furniture when she visited after the funeral. The clock over the stove made its little dry ticking sound. I fed the dog, filled my own glass with water, and stood at the sink without drinking any of it. Then I sat down with a legal pad and wrote 3 lines. Step 1, call David. Step 2, have the drive reviewed by someone independent. Step 3, say nothing until the facts are fixed in paper. I looked at those 3 lines for a long time. Then I folded Eleanor's letter once, placed it back in its envelope, and put the phone in front of me on the table. I didn't call right away. I just sat there with my hand resting beside it, listening to the refrigerator hum until the room felt still enough for me to speak. I called David just after noon. He answered on the second ring, and I could tell from the change in his voice that he knew something had shifted. He had spent the last several months helping me through estate paperwork, title transfers, account notices, all the practical parts of loss that keep moving whether you are ready or not. Up to that point, Most of our conversations had been about signatures and deadlines. This one was different before either of us said why. I asked if I could come by. He said yes. His office was in a 2-story brick building near the courthouse square. Not fancy, just old and orderly. The kind of place where the carpet is kept clean, the lamps are switched on even in the daytime, and every surface suggests that papers matter there. When I walked in, his receptionist gave me a small nod and told me he was expecting me. David closed the door behind me after I sat down. He didn't make small talk. I appreciated that. I put the envelope and the USB drive on his desk and said, "These were in Eleanor's safe deposit box." He looked at me for a moment, then reached for the letter first. While he read, I watched the room instead of his face. There was a framed map of Sumner County on the wall behind him, 2 shelves of binders, a legal calendar with blocks of dates marked in blue ink. The vent above the window made a low clicking sound every so often as the air came on. David read the letter all the way through. Then he went back to the second page and read part of it again. He set it down carefully. After that, he plugged in the USB drive, turned the monitor slightly away from the light, and started opening files. I could see enough from where I sat to know Eleanor had organized the photographs by date. That did not surprise me either. If she had taken the trouble to protect something, she would have done it cleanly. David scrolled in silence for a long time. Invoice copies, internal approvals, routing sheets, screenshots of ledgers. A few photographs were slightly blurred, taken quickly, but most were readable. Eleanor must have steadied the phone against the desk or held her breath when she took them. I could almost picture her doing it, standing in my office in the late afternoon light, hearing a car door somewhere outside, listening for the sound of tires in the gravel. Finally, David leaned back in his chair. He did not say this is terrible. He did not say I'm sorry. He said, "You were right to bring this here first." That sentence mattered to me more than any other one he could have used. I asked him what he thought. He answered the way a careful attorney answers when he knows the facts may carry farther than the room. He said the material appeared credible. He said it suggested more than bookkeeping mistakes. He said if the records matched actual company systems, then we were likely looking at a pattern, not an incident. Then he paused and folded his hands together. "There are 2 separate issues here," he said. "One is the business. The other is your son. Those may overlap, but they can't be handled emotionally if we want the truth to hold." I nodded. That was when the conversation shifted from grief to process. David took out a yellow pad and began writing while he spoke. "First," he said, "the drive needed to be copied and preserved properly so no one could later claim the files had been altered. Second, the images had to be reviewed by someone qualified to identify what they actually showed and what records would need to be matched against them. Third, no one connected to the company could be warned, not directly and not indirectly. No unusual questions. No requests for old files. No sudden interest in line items I had ignored for years. If someone had built a system to move money quietly, the worst thing we could do was give them time to clean it." I remember looking at the yellow pad as he wrote. His list made the situation feel both larger and more manageable at the same time. Larger, because this was no longer just a painful family discovery. It had shape now. Procedure. Edges. More manageable, because once something has steps, it stops being a fog. David said he wanted to bring in an outside forensic accountant. Someone with no tie to our firm, our local accounting office, or anyone Leonard might know. He had a name in mind. A woman in Nashville named Karen Doyle. He said she had testified in fraud cases before and had the kind of patience that made dishonest people underestimate her. I asked him if he trusted her. He said yes without hesitation. That was enough for me. He called her while I was still there. Not on speaker. Just a direct, concise call from his desk phone. He told her he had documents suggesting long-term billing irregularities tied to a construction company and wanted a confidential review as soon as possible. He listened, asked 2 questions, checked his calendar, and arranged to meet her the following Thursday. When he hung up, he told me not to contact Ryan. I had not said I intended to, but he knew I had thought about it. He also told me not to contact Leonard and not to speak to the outside accountants until Karen had reviewed the material. He said even innocent people often start protecting themselves the moment they hear the word discrepancy. Sometimes that protection buries the truth before anyone gets a clean look at it. I told him there was one more thing. Then I told him about the bank footage. About Ryan trying to access Eleanor's box 9 days earlier. David did not interrupt me once. He only asked Linda's full name, the bank branch, and the exact words she had used about the attempted access. When I finished, he wrote those down too. He was quiet for a few seconds after that. Then he said, "That raises the stakes." I knew he was right. He asked whether Ryan could have known Eleanor was keeping records. I said I didn't know. He asked whether Leonard knew about the safe deposit box. I told him Eleanor had mentioned it openly over the years, but not what was inside it. It was one of those ordinary facts families and business friends absorb without noticing. Bank box, important papers, ring, deed, that sort of thing. David tapped his pen once against the pad. "From now on," he said, "we assume two things. One, that someone may already suspect Eleanor documented something. Two, that we cannot know yet who knows what." That sentence stayed with me. Until then, grief had still been setting the pace. After that, caution took over. David made 2 copies of the drive while I sat there. One went into a sealed evidence envelope with his initials across the flap. One stayed for Karen's review. He asked me to keep the original in my possession and not plug it into any home computer. He placed the letter in a plastic sleeve and said he would scan it, log it, and return the original to me before I left. Watching him do those small things settled me more than I expected. The envelopes, the initials, the date notation, the chain of custody form. Little acts, but each one quietly said the same thing. This is real, and it can be handled. By the time I left his office, the light outside had gone a little gray. I sat in my truck for a moment before starting it. My phone was in the cup holder. Ryan's name was in my contacts like it had always been. One tap away. I thought about calling him, not to accuse him, not even to ask a question, just to hear his voice and measure something in it. I didn't. Silence, I was beginning to understand, was not the same as hesitation. Sometimes it was the first disciplined thing a person did. I drove home the long way, out past the farm supply store and along the road that ran by the creek. The fields were still winter flat. A few patches of standing water reflected the sky in dull silver strips. At a stop sign, I realized my jaw was clenched so hard it ached. That evening, I made soup from a container my daughter had left in the freezer weeks earlier. I heated it on the stove, stirred it slowly, and stood there while steam clouded the kitchen window over the sink. The dog stayed close to my leg, sensing the change in me the way dogs do without understanding any of the words. I ate at the table with Eleanor's envelope beside my plate. Not open now, just there. After dinner, I went into my office for the first time in a while and stood in the doorway without turning on the light. Her letter had changed the room. Same desk, same filing cabinet, same shelves with permit binders and old project folders. But now I could see the place from her position instead of mine. The lower drawer, the angle of the chair, the way the late sun would hit the desktop in the afternoon. I turned on the lamp and opened the lower right drawer. Inside were staplers, envelopes, an old tape measure, a few pins that no longer worked, and a stack of manuals I had not touched in years. Nothing else. No hidden folder. No duplicate records. No obvious trace of what she had found there. Which meant either the material had been removed after she photographed it, or it had never stayed there long. I closed the drawer and stood still. Then I began to do what I should have done much earlier in the life of that business. Not a full search. Not enough to disturb anything. Just a quiet look. My own desk calendar. Old notebooks. Check copies. Vendor lists. A few project closeout folders I kept for sentimental reasons more than practical ones. Patterns began to come back to me in fragments. Jobs where Leonard had insisted on certain vendors. Times he had said a billing line needed to stay off the standard summary until year-end. Payments he had called timing issues. Mild explanations. Plausible explanations. The sort of explanations a man accepts when he trusts the person saying them and is already tired from running everything else. I wrote down names as I remembered them, not conclusions, just names. 3 vendors, 2 project codes, 1 storage unit address tied to delivered materials that, now that I thought about it, had never stayed on site long enough to match the invoices. I stopped there. David had told me not to start digging on my own, and I meant to follow that. But memory itself had already started moving, and I knew enough not to ignore it anymore. A little after 9, my phone lit up. Ryan. I looked at his name on the screen until it stopped ringing. A minute later, a text came through. "Hey Dad, just checking in. Haven't heard from you in a few days. You doing okay?" I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the desk and did not answer. And then I waited. I left the phone face down until morning. Ryan did not call again that night. No second text. No little follow-up question to soften the first one. Just silence after that single message, and I found myself studying the silence the way I used to study job sites before a concrete pour. Not for emotion, for timing. The next morning I replied with 3 words. I'm fine. Busy. Nothing more. It was true enough to stand on, and short enough not to invite anything. A few minutes later he sent back, okay, let me know if you need anything. I read that too, then put the phone away and made eggs. The skillet clicked lightly as it heated. The kitchen window had fogged at the lower corners. Outside, the yard looked pale and damp from the night before. Ordinary morning. Ordinary sounds. I stood there with a plate in my hand and had the strange feeling that life had split into 2 clean layers. On the surface, breakfast, the dog, the mail. Underneath, documents, names, dates, and a question I still could not answer about my own son. By Thursday, I was back in David's office. Karen Doyle was already there when I arrived. She was smaller than I expected, somewhere in her early 50s, with reading glasses hanging from a chain and a legal pad lined with tight, square handwriting. She stood when I came in, shook my hand once, and said my name as if she had already placed it into a file in her head. There was no wasted motion in her. David had the photographs on a monitor and printed contact sheets on the conference table. Karen spent the first 20 minutes looking without speaking. She would stop at one page, lean in, make a note, then move to the next with the kind of patience that made the room feel quieter. She did not react to anything outwardly. No raised eyebrows. No little noises of surprise. Just work. I liked her immediately for that reason. At one point she asked David to enlarge a photographed invoice and hold it beside a separate approval page. Then she asked for a routing slip from a different date. She compared vendor names, account strings, payment sequences. Her pen moved in short, controlled strokes. Finally, she sat back and took off her glasses. What I can say today, she said, is that this does not read like accidental sloppiness. She said there appeared to be a duplicate path for selected costs. Inflated vendor billing on some jobs, possibly fabricated vendors on others. Payments broken into amounts that would not always attract attention during normal review. She said whoever set it up understood enough about workflow to hide inside it. Then she tapped 2 pages near the center of the spread. And your son's name appears here and here as an approving party. I said yes. My voice sounded flat, but steady. Karen nodded once. That does not tell me intent by itself. It tells me involvement on paper. Those are different things. That mattered. She went on to explain that the photos alone were not enough to establish full loss. They were enough to justify deeper review. To do that, she would need access to actual accounting records, vendor files, payment histories, job cost reports, and anything tied to internal approval chains. Not just 1 year. Several. David asked her whether this could be done quietly. Karen said yes, if the request for records came through a channel that looked routine. Not a criminal accusation. Not a dramatic internal inquiry. Something procedural. Something a dishonest man might glance at and decide was irritating, but not threatening. That was the first moment I saw the path clearly. The estate still included my ownership interest in the company. Some of the paperwork around valuation and disposition was unfinished. David said that gave him a narrow procedural door to request a financial review tied to the estate's business holdings. A normal enough step, especially with tax consequences and post-death asset evaluation still in motion. Karen looked at me then and said, "The key is that once this begins, you become boring." I asked her what she meant. "You do nothing unusual," she said. "You don't ask sharper questions. You don't suddenly become attentive in ways you haven't been. You sign what you normally sign. You attend what you normally attend. You let the paperwork be the only thing that moves." That was the strategy in one sentence. I wrote it down. On the drive home, I repeated the plan to myself in steps. Step 1. Let David request the review through the estate. Step 2. Give Karen access only through ordinary channels. Step 3. Change nothing in my behavior. Step 4. Keep Ryan and Leonard separated from my suspicions as long as possible. It calmed me to hear it as a sequence. Not because it made the situation easy. It didn't. But order has its own effect on fear. It narrows it. Over the next 2 weeks, that order held. David filed the request exactly as Karen suggested. A routine auditor review related to valuation of my ownership interest and estate exposure. The wording was dry and forgettable. Leonard received it through the usual channels and did not object. That, more than anything else, told me he did not believe anyone was close enough to matter. Karen was brought in under the label of an outside financial consultant assisting with the review. She was given access to records, not because anyone wanted to confess something, but because saying no would have looked stranger than saying yes. At the office, I became careful in the simplest ways. I arrived when I normally arrived. I left when I normally left. I asked about weather delays, delivery schedules, permit timing, the things I had always asked. I did not suddenly hover over accounting. I did not start pulling old files in public. I did not use a different tone with Leonard or Ryan. Silence, again, was work. Leonard remained himself, easy with clients, crisp in meetings. He wore confidence the way some men wear a sport coat, comfortably and without thinking. If he noticed that paperwork was moving around him, he treated it like the kind of administrative nuisance successful men tolerate because somebody else eventually makes it disappear. Ryan was harder to read. He seemed more careful around me than usual, though not enough that anyone else would have noticed. A slight pause before answering. More eye contact when he gave me updates. One afternoon, he offered to take over a vendor reconciliation issue that had nothing to do with his immediate responsibilities, and I found myself wondering whether that was habit, guilt, or simply a son trying to be useful in front of his father. I did not ask. There were moments when I nearly broke my own rules. Once, in the conference room, Leonard mentioned a materials supplier on a warehouse job outside Murfreesboro, and I felt a strong, immediate recognition. Karen had already flagged a related billing trail from Eleanor's photographs. The old version of me would have said something right then, asked for backup, requested the invoice, forced a little daylight into the room. I didn't. I made a note after the meeting and kept going. Another time, Ryan stepped into my office late in the day while I was reviewing subcontractor insurance renewals. The hallway behind him smelled faintly of sawdust and coffee from the break area. He stood in the doorway with one hand in his pocket and asked if I wanted to grab dinner sometime that weekend. There was hesitation in him. Not enough to be obvious, just enough for a father to hear. I looked up at him and said, "Maybe next week. I've got some estate things to sort through." He nodded too quickly. That was all. When he left, I stayed still for a long minute after the door closed. Not because I was unsure what to do, because I was. The hardest part of that period was not the paperwork or the waiting. It was sitting inside ordinary conversations while carrying knowledge that could ruin what remained of your family if handled 1 inch too early. Karen worked steadily in the background. She rarely called me directly. Most communication went through David, which was better, cleaner. But every few days I would get a brief update. Another project reviewed. Another vendor trail opened. Another sequence of approvals linked across multiple years. She was building structure, not just suspicion. At home, I kept my habits simple on purpose. I mowed the yard when it needed it, paid utility bills, sorted mail into stacks at the end of the counter. I washed Eleanor's coffee mug by hand, even though no one had used it in months. Some evenings I sat on the porch until the light dropped out of the fields and the insects took over the sound from the birds. The routine was not denial. It was ballast. 3 weeks into Karen's review, David called and asked me to come in first thing the next morning. His voice was even, but shorter than usual. That told me enough. I drove over early. The courthouse square was still quiet. One bakery had just opened, and the sidewalk smelled faintly of bread and wet concrete. In David's conference room, Karen had a stack of binders, a laptop, and a spread of summary sheets arranged in neat columns. She did not ease into it. She said the documented diversion was larger than the photographs alone had suggested. Approximately $1.1 million over 6 years. 9 projects. 11 shell vendors, most of them dissolved or inactive now. One still technically open under the name of a relative of Leonard's who, Karen believed, likely did not understand their information had been used. She said the structure was sophisticated enough to survive ordinary quarterly reviews, especially if outside accountants were relying too heavily on provided summaries and not testing underlying vendor legitimacy. Negligence, probably. Collusion, not yet supported. Then she turned one of the summary pages toward me. Ryan's name appeared in 8 payment approvals over a 2-year period tied directly to shell vendor releases. 8. Not 2. 8. I read the page without saying anything. Karen spoke carefully. The paper trail showed participation in approvals. It did not yet prove when he understood the structure, how much he understood, or whether he had been drawn in gradually. Those questions might matter later. For now, what mattered was that his documented role had expanded. David let the room stay quiet after that. I appreciated him for it. Some facts need a little empty space around them before they can settle into a person properly. Then he said the next step was federal referral. Construction fraud tied to interstate payments, shell companies, falsified billing, possible mail, and wire components. This was beyond an internal business dispute now. He had already spoken informally with a contact in the Nashville field office. They were interested enough to review a formal package once Karen finalized her summary. I asked one question. Do I talk to Ryan before that? Karen looked at David. David looked back at me. And for a few seconds, nobody said anything at all. David was the one who answered. He said, "Not yet, unless there is a reason beyond emotion." It was a fair line, a clean one. I sat with it for a moment and then nodded, because I knew exactly what he meant. If I spoke to Ryan only because I needed relief from not knowing, then I would be doing it for myself, not for the truth. And by then too much depended on doing things in the right order. So I left David's office and did nothing. At least, nothing visible. The referral package went forward the following week. Karen finalized her summary. David attached the supporting materials, and everything moved through formal channels to a federal office in Nashville. I was told the name of the agent reviewing it, but not much more at first. That was fine. I had learned by then that important processes often sounded smaller than they were while they were still in motion. At work, the days kept their shape. Phones rang. Concrete trucks arrived late. A permit office called with a correction request on a drainage detail. A client asked whether storefront glass could be installed 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and Leonard gave him one of his polished answers that sounded optimistic without promising anything exact. Ryan coordinated deliveries on a church renovation and sent me a spreadsheet of subcontractor timing that was organized, accurate, and impossible for me to read without thinking about those 8 approvals. That was the strange part. No single moment looked dramatic from the outside. The real pressure was in normal things continuing. One Tuesday afternoon, Leonard and I sat through a routine project review in the conference room. Someone had brought in coffee from the place near the bypass, and the whole room smelled like dark roast and paper cups. Leonard talked through costs on a distribution job as if he had done nothing more serious in the past 6 years than negotiate a few tight margins. He leaned back in his chair, loosened his tie a little, and made a joke about one of the inspectors being married to his clipboard. Everyone laughed, including me. Not because I found it funny, because that was still the correct response in the room. I remember thinking, then that composure has very little to do with calm feelings. Most of the time, it is just a decision repeated often enough that nobody else can tell how much effort it takes. A few days later, David called and asked me to come by in person. He told me the federal office had opened a formal review and would likely move toward interviews and records collection. He also said something else, more carefully. Based on the existing documents and Karen's analysis, they considered Ryan potentially exposed, but still distinguishable from Leonard in terms of authority, control, and likely gang. That did not remove consequences. It only meant the system could still tell the difference between the person who designed a structure and the person who signed inside it. I asked David the same question again. Do I talk to him now? This time he did not answer right away. Instead, he asked me what I wanted from the conversation. I told him the truth. I needed to look at my son before everything official arrived. Before interviews, counsel, legal language, and other people started teaching him how to answer. I needed one conversation that belonged to us, even if it changed nothing. David listened without interrupting. Then he said, "If you do this, you do it with rules." He took out his yellow pad again. No threats. No accusations you cannot support. No details about federal timing. No warnings that would help anyone destroy evidence or align stories. One question at a time. And the moment he lies to you in a way that changes risk, you leave and call me. I told him I understood. He said one more thing before I left. Do not go there as a wounded father. Go there as a man who already knows enough. That line stayed with me all the way to Ryan's apartment. He lived in a 2-story complex off a side road near Gallatin, the kind built in the early 2000s with narrow balconies and parking spaces that never seemed wide enough. I drove there on a Thursday evening just before sunset. The air still held a little warmth, but the shadows between the buildings had already turned cool. I sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. Then I went upstairs and knocked. Ryan opened the door in jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. He had his mother's eyes, which was difficult enough on a good day. The moment he saw me, something in his face tightened. Not panic, recognition. He stepped back and let me in. His apartment was neat in the way of someone who had cleaned recently and wanted it to look accidental. The television was off. There was a plate in the sink, one coffee mug on the counter, a stack of unopened mail near the fruit bowl. A fan turned slowly in the corner of the living room, making a soft ticking sound each time it passed one point in its rotation. He asked if I wanted anything to drink. I said no. We sat at the small kitchen table, and for a little while I said nothing at all. Ryan didn't rush to fill it. That, more than anything, told me how serious he already knew this was. The younger version of my son would have talked too soon, explained before being asked, reached for noise. This version waited. Finally, I told him I had gone to the bank. He looked down once, then back up. I told him there had been a letter in Eleanor's safe deposit box. I said there were documents. I said those documents had been reviewed. I told him I was not there to bargain with him, and not there to create a scene. I said I needed the truth from him while there was still a version of truth that could be spoken plainly. Then I asked the only question I had decided to ask first. Did you know, when it started, what Leonard was actually doing? Ryan looked at the table for so long I could hear the fan tick behind him. Then he said, no, he didn't say it quickly. He said it like a man stepping onto ice and wanting to feel whether it would hold. I asked him to explain. He told me Leonard had described the arrangement as a specialized vendor structure that sat outside the standard billing system for tax and timing reasons. He said it had been presented to him as legal, though quiet. Not something to discuss broadly, but not fraud. Just one of those executive methods people on the inside used, and people lower down were expected to process without fully understanding. That sounded plausible enough to bother me. Ryan went on. He said he had believed it at first because Leonard was the senior partner, because the paperwork looked formal, and because, in his words, I didn't know enough to know what I should have questioned sooner. I asked him when that changed. He said about 6 months in. He told me that by then he had started seeing approvals and vendor names repeat in ways that no longer made sense. He asked a few questions. Leonard answered them indirectly the first time and more sharply the second. After that, Ryan understood enough to know the thing was wrong, even if he still did not know the full size of it. I asked him why he stayed in it. His face changed then, not dramatically, just a kind of inward collapse around the eyes. He said Leonard made it clear that if Ryan tried to step away, the approvals already carrying his name would make him part of it anyway. That nobody would believe a younger employee over a senior partner. That by then the signature trail was already there. He said Leonard never shouted, never threatened him in plain language. He just explained, calmly, what things would look like if questions were ever asked. That part, more than anything, sounded like Leonard. I asked Ryan why he hadn't come to me. He swallowed once before answering. He said because every month that passed made it harder. Because shame grows while it sits in the dark. Because once he understood how bad it was, he was already tangled in records he didn't know how to untangle without burning down the company, hurting me, and exposing himself all at once. He said he told himself for too long that he was trying to find a clean way out. Then he said something that made me go very still. He said he had not known about his mother's investigation, not while she was alive, not afterward either. He said the reason he went to the bank was not because he knew what was in the box, but because Leonard had mentioned, in passing, that Eleanor used to keep sensitive papers there, and Ryan panicked after hearing estate matters were moving again. He said he thought there might be records in the box that could make everything worse. He told himself he was going there to see what existed, maybe to protect himself, maybe to understand what his mother had known. I asked him whether Leonard sent him. Ryan said no. I believed that answer. Not because I wanted to. Because Ryan had always been a poor liar in one specific way. When he lied out of convenience, he added too much. Too many details, too many angles, too much effort to make the story smooth. Here, he did the opposite. He left gaps. He winced at his own words. He answered plainly where plainness hurt him most. I asked him one last thing. Did you profit from it? He said not in the way Leonard did. He said there had been bonuses, extra payments, things framed as performance recognition, but he had never controlled the structure and never received the real money. He said for a long time, he told himself that distinction mattered more than it did. I sat with that. Then I told him what he needed to hear, and I kept my voice as even as I could. I said this was beyond family now. Beyond me. I said he needed a very good attorney and needed one quickly. I said cooperation would matter, but it would not erase paper. I said I was not there to promise protection and not there to offer forgiveness on demand. He nodded. He looked younger in that moment than he had in years. Then I told him I loved him. That was the hardest sentence in the room and the simplest. I stood up after that. He stood too, but neither of us moved toward the other. No handshake, no embrace, nothing false. At the door, he said, very quietly, "Dad, I am sorry." I looked at him and said, "I know." Then I left. The air outside had cooled. Somewhere across the parking lot, someone was grilling on a balcony, and the smell of charcoal hung low between the buildings. I went down the stairs slowly, got back into my truck, and put both hands on the steering wheel before starting the engine. I did not feel relief. What I felt was something narrower and cleaner. The guesswork was over. By the time I got home, the porch light had already come on by timer. The dog was waiting inside the front window. I fed him, poured a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the television. Then I called David and told him, as exactly as I could, what Ryan had said. And then I stopped talking. David listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked only a few questions. The exact wording Ryan had used about Leonard. Whether Ryan had claimed Leonard sent him to the bank. Whether he had admitted personal financial benefit beyond salary and bonuses. David wrote things down as I answered. I could hear the scratch of his pen through the line. Then he said, "You did the right amount." That was his way of telling me I had not said too much. After that, events began moving on their own timetable. I was not brought into every detail, and that was probably for the best. But enough reached me through David that I could understand the shape of things. The federal review became an active investigation. Subpoenas went out for financial records. Vendor histories were pulled. Corporate registrations were compared. Payment trails were mapped across accounts and dates and projects. Karen's summary had opened the door. The rest now belonged to systems larger than any one person's will. At the office, nothing looked different at first. That may sound strange, but it's true. Fraud does not announce its collapse in the lobby. A receptionist still answers the phone. Delivery drivers still ask where to unload. A superintendent still complains about weather delays. Most endings begin looking exactly like the middle until the hour they don't. The Friday it changed, I was at home. David called just after 9 in the morning. He told me Leonard had been arrested at the office on federal fraud charges tied to the billing scheme and shell vendors. Investigators were also executing records actions connected to the company's financial systems. By the time he reached me, it was already done. I thanked him, set the phone down, and stood at the kitchen counter with one hand on the edge of it. There was no rush of triumph. No clean feeling of justice arriving all at once. Mostly I felt tired. A kind of fatigue that seemed to go behind the eyes and settle in the bones. Underneath that, there was some relief, but even that came quietly. The waiting part was over. The part where truth existed mostly in envelopes and spreadsheets and careful conversations had given way to official fact. A little later, Anna called from Ohio. By then she already knew something had happened. News moves quickly once men in suits and agents and windbreakers show up at a business office in daylight. I told her only what she needed at first. That Leonard had been arrested. That the investigation was real. That Ryan had legal trouble ahead. But the situation was not identical for both men. She was quiet for a second, then asked, "And you?" It was such a simple question that I nearly laughed. "I'm standing in the kitchen," I told her. She understood what I meant. Over the next several weeks, the details became firmer. Karen's findings held up under deeper review. The diverted amount settled at just over $1.1 million across 6 years and 9 projects. 11 shell entities were tied into the structure in one way or another. Most had been dissolved or left dormant. One active company led back to a relative of Leonard's who, according to later interviews, appeared to have had little understanding of how their information had been used. The outside accounting firm that had signed off on quarterly summaries was found to have missed obvious warning signs and failed to test vendor legitimacy with the level of care they should have used. Negligent, in Karen's view. Not knowingly involved. Ryan retained counsel quickly, which was wise. What mattered in the months that followed was not whether he was blameless. He wasn't. His name sat where it sat on those approvals. Paper has a way of stripping family language off a person and reducing them to role, date, action, signature. But paper can also show gradations, and those gradations mattered. Leonard had built the structure. Leonard had controlled the relationships. Leonard had directed the hidden side of the system and profited from it at the top. Ryan had signed inside a mechanism he first failed to understand, then failed to escape properly once he did. That distinction did not erase harm. It just told the truth more accurately. At one point, there was a separate development that I need to say carefully. Based on David's formal request and some things found in Eleanor's records, a separate review was opened into her accident. I cannot tell you that this produced a final, clean answer. It did not. An accident reconstruction specialist revisited the original report and found a few irregularities he described as worth further examination. Not proof, not certainty. Enough to keep the question from being closed too quickly. As of the last update I received, that matter remained unresolved. I had to learn to live with that. There are some facts you can lock down with numbers, dates, bank trails, and sworn statements. And there are others that stay in a room with the door partly open, never fully entering daylight. I would have preferred certainty. I did not get it. At my age, you learn that wanting a complete answer does not always mean the world is prepared to offer one. The business itself had to be untangled next. By then, the old partnership was finished in every way that mattered. Leonard's assets were subject to recovery proceedings. My attorneys moved to dissolve what remained of the structure we had shared. Because I held the licenses and operational authority, the company could continue, but only if I chose to carry it forward under a different shape. I thought about that carefully. For a while, I considered shutting it all down. 30 years of work reduced to sale value and memory. Clean, maybe. Final. But the more I sat with it, the more I knew that was not what I wanted. Leonard had taken money in trust. I was not inclined to hand him the rest by walking away from the work itself. So I changed the terms instead. I brought in a project manager I trusted, someone older, careful, and almost offensively methodical with contracts. I scaled the business back. Fewer projects, smaller jobs, clients I knew well enough to call directly, tighter approval channels. No vendor added without full verification. No payment release without dual sign-off. No one person, including me, allowed the luxury of assumption anymore. The new systems were not elegant, but they were sound. That mattered more. Ryan's case resolved more quietly than many people would have expected from hearing only the broad outline. He cooperated. His attorney negotiated from that posture. The result involved a substantial financial penalty, a probationary term under supervision, and professional restrictions that effectively ended his path in construction. He did not go to prison. Some people would hear that and call it lenient. Some would say the paper should have pulled him farther down. I understand both reactions, but I had lived too close to the details to need other people's simplicity. He was accountable, and he was still my son. That did not repair trust by itself. Trust came back the way damaged wood dries, slowly, unevenly, with some places stronger than before and some places never quite the same. He left construction completely and found work in a different field. We began with phone calls, short at first. Practical things, how I was sleeping, whether the dog was still limping in the mornings, whether Anna's boys had started baseball yet. No one pushed for meaning. We just stayed in contact long enough for contact itself to become honest again. Anna came down for 3 weeks when the legal pieces were at their worst. She helped me sort Eleanor's clothes, which I still had not managed to do. She made dinners without announcing that she was taking care of me. She wiped counters, folded towels, cleared stacks of old mail from the hall table, and sat with me in the evenings without trying to manufacture the right words. That was always her gift. She understood that presence is usually more useful than interpretation. One night, after she had gone upstairs, I found Eleanor's recipe box still sitting where it had always sat near the pantry. I opened it and stood there reading cards in her handwriting. Chili, cornbread, chicken, and rice. Nothing profound, just evidence of a life built in repetition and care. That, in the end, was what the whole ordeal had clarified for me. Not only what had been stolen, but what had actually been defended. Eleanor had not hidden those records because she loved conflict or wanted to expose someone dramatically. She had done it because she understood that a life built over decades can be damaged quietly if no one is paying attention. She had seen danger where I had seen routine. She had moved carefully, documented what she could, and placed it where she believed it would survive long enough to matter. And it did. Months later, when most of the legal noise had settled and the office had found its smaller, steadier rhythm, I went in early one morning before anyone else arrived. The building smelled faintly of dust, copy paper, and old coffee from the break room machine. Sunlight was just reaching across the front windows. I unlocked my office, sat down at the desk, and opened the top drawer. Eleanor's letter was there. I had stopped locking it away by then. I read the last page only, folded it back into the envelope, and placed it where I could reach it if I wanted to. Then I took out the new approval forms we had put in place, reviewed the vendor list for the month, and started the day. No speech, no ceremony, just order. Then I waited for the kettle to finish at home that evening before deciding what to do next. These days, my mornings are quieter. I get up early, usually before the sun has fully worked its way over the trees. I put water on for tea. I let the dog out. I stand at the kitchen sink and look across the yard while the house settles into itself. Floorboards make their small sounds. The refrigerator hums. The first light reaches the back fence in pieces. For a long time after Eleanor died, quiet felt empty. Now it feels more like shape. I have kept some of her things exactly where they always were. Her recipe box near the pantry. Her gardening gloves on the shelf by the mudroom door. A blue bowl she liked on the table by the window. Not as a shrine. Just because a home is still a home when love has been in it long enough. You do not need to strip everything bare to prove you are moving forward. Most evenings, I straighten the kitchen before bed. I rinse my cup. I wipe the counter. I sort whatever came in the mail and stack it in the right place. The habits are simple, but I have come to respect simple things more than I used to. Systems fail when people get lazy with details. Families strain the same way. So I pay attention now. Not anxiously. Just on purpose. The business is smaller, and that was the right decision. I know the clients better. I read every approval before it leaves my desk. I ask where numbers came from and who verified them. If someone seems irritated by the extra step, I take that as useful information. I'm not trying to control everything. I'm just no longer willing to confuse trust with silence. Ryan and I talk twice a week most weeks. Some calls last 10 minutes. Some last longer. We do not perform closeness. We let it build, or not build, according to what is actually there. That has made it steadier. A few months ago, he came by on a Saturday and helped me clear brush at the back of the property. We worked for almost 2 hours before either of us said anything important. Then he handed me the loppers and asked whether his mother always noticed things before everyone else did. I told him yes. He nodded like he had known that already, but needed to hear it out loud. Anna still checks on me in the practical ways that matter. She sends photos of the boys. She calls when she says she will. Every now and then she reminds me, gently, to replace a porch bulb or schedule a checkup or stop pretending that canned soup counts as dinner 3 nights in a row. Her mother would have said the same things, just with fewer words. As for Eleanor's letter, I still keep it in my desk drawer. Not locked. I read it less often now, but I still read it. Usually on evenings when the house is especially still or when I catch myself drifting toward old habits of assumption. The letter does not make me sad in the same sharp way it once did. Not only sad, anyway. What I feel now is gratitude mixed with the weight of having been loved by someone who paid attention when it mattered most. That is a serious gift, and it has stayed with me beyond a legal outcome, beyond the money, beyond the business changes and family repairs. It has settled into the ordinary parts of life. The way I review a contract. The way I listen when someone answers a question a little too smoothly. The way I look twice at anything that asks to be trusted without being checked. A few weeks ago, something happened that reminded me these situations are never as rare as people think. A man I've known casually for years stopped by the office near closing time. Retired electrician. Good hands. Quiet kind of person. He stood in the doorway with a folder tucked under his arm and asked if I had a minute. Said he wasn't sure whether he was imagining something, but a nephew of his had gotten involved in a business arrangement that didn't sit right with him, and he remembered some of what happened to me. I told him to come in and shut the door. That's how these things begin, more often than not. Not with spectacle, with a folder, a hesitation, somebody deciding they would rather ask an uncomfortable question now than live with a worse answer later. So I made tea, set 2 cups on the desk, and listened. If you stayed with me through this story, I appreciate it. These are not easy things to tell, but sometimes a calm telling is the only honest kind. If this meant something to you, please like and subscribe. And in the comments, tell me which city you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I always like seeing where people are listening from. 2 more popular stories will appear next, and I think you'll find something of value in those too.